Good morning from the IMF headquarters. Thank you for joining us here for a discussion of the Atlantic Council on Egypt and its relationship with the IMF. I'm here today with two very distinguished guests. First, we have Hani Dimyan, the former finance minister of Egypt from 2014 to 16. And you were voted also Africa's finance minister of the year in 2015, I believe. Yep. Since you left, you have been active in the private sector, and now you are the founder and head of Ivy Strategies, a consulting firm in New York.
That is correct.
And then we have Adnan Mazarei, a good former colleague from the IMF. Adnan, before you also left the IMF for the Peterson Institute, where you're now a senior fellow, you were taking care of countries in the Middle East, but also you served as advisor to the first deputy managing director of the IMF a while ago, and you've been active in debt restructuring issues and international financial architecture and the Santiago Principles for Sovereign Wealth Funds. Welcome to you both, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Adnan, you wrote a paper just recently on Egypt's 2023-24 economic crisis with the question, will this time be different? Now, Egypt is yet again under an IMF program, and what do you think? Is it different this time? What does the program try to achieve, and do you think it will be successful?
Look, Egypt had gotten into some difficulties recently, even before the Gaza war, due to the shock of the COVID pandemic, large food price increases, and as many people know, Egypt is perhaps the largest wheat importer in the world. So it was suffering some things that came from the outside. But these shocks came on top of a generally weak public finances and external position, a debt issue, and excessive reliance on foreign financing. Okay. Then came the Gaza war, which affected especially remittances and revenues from the Suez Canal, and general uncertainty that affected trade. Now, against the background of these issues, the IMF program with Egypt was resuscitated and expanded from about 3 billion to 8 billion. And a number of countries and institutions contributed financially. Egypt, therefore, has been able to stabilize the situation. They've done some important policy measures, a large devaluation of the exchange rate, the floating of the exchange rate again, increases in interest rates, some cuts in subsidies, but they're also going to try to address some longer term issues, for example, enhancing the playing field for the private sector. Things have gone well so far, but the issue, as you said, is whether they will continue or not. In this paper, my co-author and I, Ruchir Agrawal, we looked back to see why there are these recurrent issues. And Egypt is not the only one with recurrent balance of payments problems.
Right.
We examined 8 balance of payments episodes from 1956. And we asked ourselves, why does this happen often? Of course, there were the issue of external shocks that had nothing to do with Egypt. For example, ranging from, again, the 1956 Suez crisis all the way to COVID and the Ukraine war. But there were also 3 other factors. One was a set of policies. For example, this over-reliance on fixed exchange rates. But then we asked ourselves, behind macro policies, there are usually political economy factors. The political economy factors are deep in Egypt, and they relate to go back to the 50s when the country was ruled by a developmental state that was very much interested in large projects and moving the economy forward. It was still did not have significant amounts of resources, so it had to rely on external aid and borrowing, which set it up for debt crises. And they were repeated debt crises several times. They had to get Paris Club restructurings. But then we said, let's go a bit deeper. This developmental state led to a strong role of the state and the government in the economy, a strong role for the army, inward orientation of the economy. There have been episodes of successful reforms, some in 70s, some as late as 2004, 2008, 9. So reforms can be done. But there's a combination of elite interests that are now ingrained that have not been allowing reforms, etc. And then there was one other factor. The ability of Egypt to rely on external assistance, benefiting from its very significant geopolitical position. So this effective safety net has allowed the country, or at least its elites, to think they can get away without making reforms. Okay, and by and large, they have not been wrong.
Hani, I mean, obviously you know Egypt inside out, not only through your role as minister, but do you broadly agree with that analysis? And do you also think that maybe this program this time around will have a chance to make a difference?
I agree in a broad sense with the framework that was presented by Adnan, but I have some maybe different views on certain aspects. So with regard to the exchange rate, I totally agree that Egypt was in favor of having a fixed exchange rate in most of the recent history. The problem was not in the pegging exchange rate, whether it was just fixed or whether it was a crawling peg or with a band or whatever the system that was used. The problem that the inconsistency in the policy mix that did not provide the right credentials for that peg to succeed. Because in my view, actually, you cannot have a free float for Egypt. This is my view. No one can have a free float, even in the G7. And the central banks of the G7, they interact together since the 2008. I was sitting on the IMFC as the chair of deputies, and I was also the chair of the communique drafting. So I saw how the new architecture of collaboration between the big countries and even between the emerging countries started to take a different shape to avoid turbulences in the entire monetary and financial architecture. But in the case of Egypt, it's a small open economy, and flexibility is needed. And I would say more important than flexibility or pegging or whatever it is, the consistency in the policy mix is what will promote sustainability of the success of any policy you do, whether under a program with IMF or without a program. Adnan rightly mentioned that between 2004, 2009, actually it was until 2011, we had a very ambitious economic reform outside of the IMF. We went to the IMF, probably Adnan was there also and had the hands on, and in the 1990s, and we did not withdraw any of the committed funds from the IMF. In 2014 to 2016, I was in charge in this, and we had a very ambitious program that its entirety was taken as the prerequisite for the 2016 IMF program. We reformed everything, but my focus, and at the time I was not, or I didn't see there was a critical need to run to the IMF at the point. My critical need was to elevate the country credit worthiness and credit rating, and this is what was the focus, and we had 4 episodes of positive ratings, and then we went back to the international markets. We had a very successful bond issuance, was bond issuance of the year for sub-investment groups, etc., etc. So reforms were not connected in entirety to the IMF, but there were periods of interruptions. We have to address that. Some of them were just because of political upheavals in the 2011, 2012, 2013. These were years where everything was stalled, not only on the economic front, on the developmental front, on social aspects. Maybe social aspects were were not as stagnant because people were on the street, so you had to accommodate a lot of the demands, etc. During the different regimes, different governments. But the economy was effectively stalled. So, coming to those particular issues, with the exchange rate, whether it's a flexible, it has to be flexible, but whether it's a peg or it's a managed float or whatever it is, it needs to be under a consistent policy framework. That's number one.
Yes.
Two, for the role of state, Adnan is right. The role of state increased in the recent years. Facts. A little bit of history. I remember this time, because I did not leave Egypt since the Mubarak era. So during the Mubarak, SCAF, Muslim Brotherhood, President Mansour, and President Sisi. So I stayed there all the time. I did not leave my office. I was chief negotiator with IMF during the SCAF period. So what I want to say that because the loss or the confidence loss that happened, private sector was not willing to get into long-term projects. There was a massive infrastructure gap, massive energy deficit, and no one would come and invest, even for the industries. They were just cutting the current electricity current and gas supplies from the industries in order to give it to the household supply. So that deficit and those infrastructure gaps, with the aspirations also to hold for the lost years, and with the aspirations to put Egypt on a different scale for growth, had to bring the government in heavily. Maybe I personally was pushing for the PPP, BOTs, and all these kind of schemes, but there was not enough appetite, except for very little particular pointed projects by the international investors, because again, the economy was fluid, the political situation was fluid, security was fluid, nothing was stable. So everybody deterred back. You had to do two things. One, to do the role of the private sector. Two, to catch up for the lost years and to start to build up. Where the problem happened was the balance sheet mismatch. And here where I was even maybe more openly critique than Adnan, that the balance sheet mismatch should not be allowed to just explode. And private sector started to come in, but rules have changed, data have changed. And recently, you may have seen the government started to take some steps by trying to reduce the weight of the public sector investments in the economy and start to raise the weight for the private sector. Many things were moving along the sides, but at least the steady state now, you do not have the energy deficit as it used to be. It just returned back recently. You do not have the infrastructure gap as it used to be, especially in the logistics with the ports and the roads, etc. Now you're ready to go. And then the government took off any tax or non-tax incentives that were given to SOEs and make it a level playing field with the private sector. As Americans say, you gain weight over time, you lose weight over time. And it's like cortisone. You cannot just apply cortisone at once with a heavy dose and then just to stop it immediately. These things will come in gradually, will be pulled out gradually. I see good signs, I see positive signs. I hear talks from government officials that this is the intention and it's going in this direction. Then, Adnan mentioned about the geopolitical rent, and it's as if there is a sort of a moral hazard issue here. And there are no reforms, you just run to the international community, you're going to get all the support that you want. Adnan, you actually an eyewitness that this is not the case in your beautiful paper here, which we were just talking about. And here, it's just saying that compelled by its worsening situation in the war in Gaza and facilitate external assistance, Egypt agreed to enact a series of economic measures. So it's not a free lunch. And this series, the main setup thus far has been a sharp devaluation. You don't have a geopolitical rent and a sharp devaluation at the same time. They are mutually exclusive. By 38% and unification of the exchange rate system. These are serious issues and should not have happened in the first place, to be honest. But I'm just responding to this geopolitical end. Let me just finish this little bit.
Okay.
And Egypt does not have the habit, like weighing. Egypt has its political weight, economic weight, has its very strong bilateral relations, and regional relations and global relations. Whether on the economic front, political front, geopolitics, on all fronts. And it has been playing like a centrist role. And this is what kept a small open economy like Egypt continue with all the challenges, domestic and external challenges, to continue going on a right path. So Egypt does not have the habit, let's say, if we're talking about geopolitical rents, does not have the habit like to announce, well, woke up in the morning, we're going to default, we're not going to pay our creditors, goodbye.
Right.
That never happened, that's not happening, and it's not in the thought to happen, okay, as far as I know, as an outsider. But other countries were doing just cross-financing between the creditors and just wake up in the morning, we're not feeling well, we're not going to pay the creditors.
No, that's actually a good point, because in part the reason I enjoy so much discussing Egypt is that it's one of these countries that come to the IMF regularly, frequently, however you want to characterize it, but it seems to always deal with very similar issues. And of course, it's not an easy cakewalk to do a devaluation, but these are the macro adjustments. But the underlying issue is still that somehow growth doesn't take off, and there may be vested interests, they are also in other countries. But my interest really in the role of the IMF also in Egypt is does the IMF even have the heft, the tools to convince Egypt and Egyptian society to actually indeed strengthen the role of the private sector and push back against those vested interests? I mean, the caricature is that the military has a very strong role and doesn't want to give up. What do you think? Does the IMF, do the international institutions actually can help with that process so that there's no need for repeated IMF programs down the road?
Let me put it probably in a little bit a different context. So I'll go back to the 2016 program. I was out of the government at the time, but I read the first review. And at the time, I knew that things down the road will not go well. And I had talks with many circles, including in the IMF. And I saw two things happening. A very, very tight program, a very big swing in the real effective exchange rate that traveled about 60 percentage points from an overvalued real of 32, 33% to an undervalued real of 30%. That swing is very hefty for a small open economy to handle. Then we saw inflation spurt. Private sector could not manage. Exports did not grow except on the oil side. So the program itself was too ambitious, too front-loaded, let alone the prerequisites that were already in place, which were all about tax reforms on the sales tax to VAT, on the property tax, which was stalled for many years, and then we implemented it for many other reforms of that heavyweight, 2% of GDP in energy subsidy corrections. All this were taken as prerequisites. Then comes a program that's so ambitious, so tight in time, and to the extent that the private sector could not handle the shock. I'm not talking here about the public sector, I'm talking about the private sector that started to gain confidence and then received all these shocks and started to scream. The government, or there were many few presidential I would say, announcements that they will support industry by 100 billion, support exports by another 100 billion, support this by 100 billion. And this had, because the economy was failing, the program was fine, the economy was not fine. So there is a difference between managing a country and managing a program. And when I was negotiating, I was always trying to make this balance, and I had my mission, the mission chiefs with me, my best friends now, until this moment, because we had the mutual understanding of what we need to happen in order to safeguard the program, safeguard the economy as a whole. So I see similarities, but not with the same extent with what happened in 2016 and now. And the private sector, while it is gaining confidence, and to me, confidence is not to receive hot money. Confidence is to have the real economy growing and functioning, etc. So I still see the monetary program is too tight. I see, and it's too ambitious. In a short period of time, you can have the same program. Actually, you don't need to change the numbers. All you need to do is just stretch the number of years. And to see that why do I need to double net international reserves over a period of 5 years with such tight program, and then saying that I have such a financing?
Understand.
These things in detail, so certain details that can tell you, look, you need to ease up, because all the pressure came into the people until the political leadership in Egypt came out and said, people's lives can be unbearable.
The balance,
So we need to balance.
Adnan, does the IMF have to kill the patient in order to have a successful operation? What do you think? I mean, the issue is really, I mean, is there room for structural reforms in this program that have a chance to last? What do you think?
First and foremost, after 25 years of working at the fund, I should say that the fund is pretty good at stabilizing economies. It is not as good in encouraging, incentivizing structural reforms and growth. Part of the problem is what Hani also referred to as the short time frame of the program. The short time frame of the program is because the fund is mostly focusing on stabilization. A second problem, frankly, and it's not Egypt, it's like most of our, I still say ours, IMF's clients that have, for example, I was a mission chief for Pakistan. The authorities had a very transactional approach to the relations with the fund. Things were squeezed into a short period, but part of the reason things were squeezed into a short period, and at times the programs are tighter than they should be, is because there is a concern on the part of the staff that things will not be done as soon as the monies are dispersed. So sometimes I think it is true that we get into maybe over-tight policies, especially in the short run. I think that is true. The question is why, again, it is not just Egypt. It's many of our membership, Argentina, for example. Why do we find ourselves in a situation of repeated programs?
Right.
Okay? The issue is the underlying factors do not go away with IMF programs. Countries need their own growth strategies, their own incentive system that is compatible, I mean the authorities' incentive system that is compatible with fixing those issues. People like me from Washington cannot go and restructure the political economy of those countries. The other problem is, unfortunately, the shareholders of the IMF. There is a political structure in the world. There is an economic structure. In many areas, the interests of short term. They haven't always been. For example, after World War II, the US-led global order had a much longer term focus. That's why they could come up with a Marshall Plan. They could do other things that really saved Europe in many ways. Now, unfortunately, the political decision-making horizons are much shorter, okay? And the underlying problems of the world are pushed back and back. For example, this debt problem that we have,
Sure.
we are coming up with, the world is trying to do some things, but in a short-term way. There are also political and geopolitical issues that underpin some of our problems, for example, in the Middle East. Most bluntly, the most important one right now is Gaza. And that requires a courageous, longer-term perspective, how to fix it such that all the countries in the region, all the people in the region, the Palestinians, the Israelis, etc., can live in peace. But unfortunately, the approaches are short-term. At the same time, the economic approaches are short-term. We need perhaps a much more ambitious global economic thinking with much more resources made available to the countries, including for settling their climate issues, restructuring, reconstruction, etc. But unfortunately, that bigger picture is the framework within which the IMF operates. And unless the owners of the IMF, the shareholders are willing to change, the IMF by itself, I don't think is going to change significantly.
We're kind of running out of time, but I would like you maybe both to answer one more question which goes exactly in that direction, maybe about 2 minutes each if you don't mind. The program in Egypt was helped by a huge investment coming out of Abu Dhabi, I believe, into Ras Al Hakma, which is an area that's being developed, I guess, as a tourist and commercial area. And there were more than, I think, $10 billion flowing into Egypt, into the foreign exchange reserves just before the program started, which was, I think, a big help in the sense that it helped rebuild reserves and provided stability for the float. Now, wouldn't it be good for the US and European shareholders to also think about creatively how to support countries through these means with the help of the private sector when they go into an IMF program to leverage the reforms that can be implemented? Shouldn't the West try to compete with these kind of investments because Egypt is such an important geopolitical ally? What do you think?
Look, on the one side, in the past several years, we have had the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. They have gone in and helped build infrastructure in many places, for example, Africa, and have contributed to development in many. It has also had some significant costs in terms of debt and repayments, etc. The problem is that the international community has not, so far, focused on what I was hoping to have said, a longer-term developmental approach. For example, there is an idea that has been floating for a development bank for the Middle East or Arab regions. That could help Egypt and other countries at least overcome some of the problems that we all face. Okay? But unfortunately, that vision so far is not there.
Annie, what do you think? Shareholders, IMF, what can they do to help?
Let me again take it to a different approach, because usually positive incentives are the right thing to do always.
Yes.
And investment is part of it. But you cannot just, maybe running a country is, again, different than running programs. And you cannot contain countries. Here I'm not just talking about Egypt, I'm just talking generally for small open economies, for emerging markets, for least developed countries, etc. I'm saying that there are bilateral interests between nations, regional interests, and multilateral interests. So you cannot just dilute everything and have it so centralized. And we were talking about decentralization in general in running countries. But this is too centralized over focus. And then, don't forget you have competitors. So if you're not offering the right price, you have people who are coming in, but as Adnan said in the example of China, it also had an impact on governance, it had an impact on transparency, it has an impact. So you have to balance it right. It is not just in a form, if I got your question correctly, in a form of twisting arms. It's not like that. because other clients would be playing the role of your best man on your wedding night.
No, I meant it in terms of positive incentives, as you said. Yeah.
Sure.
Right.
So, but again, there are mutual interests between countries. They need to exchange, whether on trade, on investments, on even between superpowers like the US, TIFA, and other nations, including Egypt. So these are exchange of benefits, and it has to, what I say, it has to be well balanced more than being well controlled.
A very realistic, if not to say, not so optimistic view, but I think all the three of us wish Egypt all the best with its program and also beyond. Thank you very much for joining us, and we're concluding this discussion on Egypt, and please stay tuned for more Atlantic Council programs. Today is the last day of the IMF World Bank annual meetings. Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.